The pearl-handled scissors gleamed in the candlelight as they sliced through more than just braided hair that September night in 1852. What began as an evening grooming ritual in a luxurious bedroom ended with crimson-staining white linen nightgowns and the mistress of Blackwood Estate gasping her final breath. This was the night Nadira Quellith transformed from a trusted lady's maid into something far more dangerous. An executioner who'd been planning her revenge with every careful braid, every gentle brushstroke, every whispered conversation over 12 years of servitude. What newspapers would call a shocking act of savage betrayal was actually justice 12 years in the making. The story of how a young woman wielding grooming scissors rewrote the fate of an entire household becomes a tale that San Antonio courts tried to bury, that Texas newspapers twisted beyond recognition, and that generations of freed people whispered about as proof that patience, when properly weaponized, could be deadlier than any gun in the West. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pearl-handled scissors caught the flicker of oil lamplight as they arced downward, finding the soft flesh of Colleen Viereth's exposed throat with practiced precision. The sound was surprisingly quiet, a wet whisper followed by a gurgling gasp that barely disturbed the silence of the master bedroom. September 14, 1852, and in the private chambers of Blackwood Estate, just outside San Antonio, Texas, Nadira Quellith had just severed more than the elaborate braids she'd been weaving for the past hour. What transformed a trusted lady's maid into a calculated killer becomes a story that San Antonio newspapers buried under headlines about cattle rustles and Indian raids. The courts twisted the facts until truth became unrecognizable, and generations of freed people whispered about it in hushed reverence, calling Nadira's name when they needed courage to face their own impossible situations. The bedroom had witnessed this same evening ritual for 12 years of Nadira's bondage. Mesquite wood furniture imported from New Orleans gleamed under crystal lamps brought by wagon train from the east. The scent of lavender water and hair oil mingled with the dry Texas wind that slipped through shuttered windows. Persian rugs muffled footsteps that had grown as familiar as breathing over more than a decade of servitude. But that Tuesday evening, the comfortable rhythm of routine shattered like fine porcelain dropped on limestone floors. Nadira stood motionless behind her mistress's vanity chair, the grooming scissors still gripped in her calloused hands, while dark blood spread across Colleen's white silk nightgown in expanding circles. The woman's eyes, wide with shock and dimming recognition, met Nadira's reflection in the ornate mirror for the last time. Colleen's mouth opened as if to scream, but only a wet gurgle emerged. Her hands flew to her throat in a futile attempt to stem the flow, but Nadira had studied anatomy through 12 years of tending wounds, preparing bodies for burial, and listening carefully to the plantation doctor's instructions. She knew exactly where to cut for efficiency and silence. The scissors had belonged to the Viereth family for 2 generations, brought from their original holdings in Louisiana when Ashton Viereth moved west to establish his cattle empire. Silver handles engraved with roses and thorns, sharp enough to cut through the thickest hair without snagging. Colleen had always been particular about her grooming tools, insisting they be sharpened weekly and polished daily. Now those same scissors, dripped with the blood of their owner, wielded by hands that had braided Colleen's auburn hair into elaborate patterns 6 evenings a week for over a decade. Hands that knew every cowlick and wave, every sensitive spot on the scalp, every angle that would make the mistress sigh with contentment. Hands that had been planning this exact moment for 3 days, ever since discovering the ledger entry that would tear apart what little Nadira had left to protect. From the San Antonio Herald, September 16, 1852, a most heinous murder occurred Tuesday last at Blackwood Estate, residence of prominent cattleman Ashton Viereth. The perpetrator, a house servant of African descent, committed the brutal act during evening grooming rituals. Mrs. Colleen Viereth, beloved wife and mother, was discovered by her husband in a state most distressing to relate, but newspaper accounts deliberately omitted the 12 years of systematic cruelty that preceded that moment. The calculated humiliations, the casual violence disguised as discipline, the psychological torture that Colleen Viereth had refined into an art form. The reporters who wrote those stories had attended Colleen's elaborate dinner parties, had courted her favor for social advancement, had benefited from her husband's political connections. They had no interest in printing truth when fiction served their purposes better. Quellith had received Nadira as a wedding gift in 1840, when Ashton consolidated his holdings and needed a wife to manage his expanding household. Nadira had been 16 then, already experienced in house service but unprepared for the particular brand of cruelty that Quellith would introduce to her life. The young woman who'd once believed that good service would earn kind treatment had learned otherwise through 12 years of lessons delivered in private whispers and public humiliations. The bedroom door remained closed, just as it did every evening during the grooming ritual. Ashton Quellith knew better than to interrupt his wife's sacred hour of beautification. The household staff understood that disturbances during this time would result in consequences that could last for days. This isolation, this guaranteed privacy, was exactly what Nadira had been counting on. She released the scissors, letting them fall onto the thick carpet with a muted thud. Blood continued pooling beneath Quellith's chair, soaking into expensive fabric that had cost more than most families earned in a year. The mistress's final breaths came in shallow, wet gasps that would haunt Nadira's dreams for years to come, though not with regret. Behind the closed door, the rest of Blackwood Estate continued its evening routines. In the kitchen, the cook prepared tomorrow's bread dough. In the servants' quarters, exhausted workers collapsed onto thin mattresses after 16-hour days. In the main parlor, Ashton Quellith reviewed cattle manifests while sipping imported whiskey, completely unaware that his wife was dying 20 feet above his head. But why then? Why that particular Tuesday evening when the routine had remained unchanged for months? The answer lay in the leather-bound ledger that Nadira had discovered 3 days earlier while cleaning Ashton's study. A ledger that contained entries detailing the planned sale of household property to cover unexpected debts from a failed cattle drive to market. The entry dated September 11, 1852, listed, quote, Negress Arissa, age 14, housemaid, estimated value $800, scheduled for auction in New Orleans within the fortnight. Arissa, who shared Nadira's small cabin behind the main house. Arissa, whose laugh could still find joy despite their circumstances. Arissa, who called Nadira sister, though no blood connected them beyond the bonds forged through shared suffering. The various mounting debts had created a familiar pattern. When money grew tight, they liquidated human assets. Nadira had watched it happen before. 3 years ago, the stable master had disappeared overnight, sold to a mining operation in California. Last year, 2 field hands had been auctioned to settle gambling debts. Each time, Quellith had supervised the sales personally, ensuring maximum profit while showing no more emotion than if selling furniture. But Arissa represented something different. She was the last connection Nadira had to anything resembling family. The thought of watching another person she cared for being led away in chains while Quellith calculated profit margins had crystallized 12 years of accumulated rage into something diamond-hard and infinitely more dangerous. Nadira had spent those 3 days since discovering the ledger entry observing with fresh eyes, planning with surgical precision. She'd noted how Quellith always closed her eyes during the scalp massage that preceded braiding, how the woman's neck remained exposed and vulnerable for several minutes, while Nadira worked oil through the long auburn hair, how the scissors were always within reach, sharp enough to cut through rope or leather with minimal effort. She'd tested the weight of the scissors during the previous evening's grooming session, noting the balance point and the force required to pierce thick fabric. Quellith had noticed nothing unusual, simply sighed with contentment as Nadira's fingers worked through her hair with practiced skill. Now Quellith sat dying in her vanity chair while Nadira faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could scream for help, claim an accident, hope that her 12 years of faithful service might earn some mercy. Or she could accept the consequences of a decision made 3 days ago when she'd chosen dignity over survival. Blackwood Estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of Texas prairie, where mesquite trees cast long shadows and the San Antonio River curved through limestone hills like a silver ribbon. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from local stone and imported timber, a monument to Ashton Quellith's ambitions and his success in transforming Spanish land grants into an empire built on cattle, cotton, and human bondage. The estate had been carved from wilderness in 1838, when Texas was still finding its identity as a republic, before statehood would complicate the careful balance between freedom and slavery that defined the region. Ashton had been among the early settlers who saw opportunity in the West, men who brought their peculiar institution with them and adapted it to the harsh realities of frontier life. Unlike the established plantations of the Deep South, Texas holdings operated with a different rhythm. The work was harder, the conditions more brutal, the isolation more complete. There were no nearby neighbors to witness cruelty, no established social networks to enforce even the minimal standards that existed in places like Louisiana or Mississippi. What happened on Blackwood Estate stayed on Blackwood Estate, hidden behind limestone walls and enforced through violence that left no visible scars. Nadira's world within this empire measured roughly 30 feet by 40, the dimensions of her shared cabin behind the main house. She'd arrived in 1840 as part of Colleen's dowry, one of 6 enslaved people brought from Louisiana to staff the growing household. The journey west had taken 3 months by wagon train, during which Nadira learned that the frontier operated by rules even harsher than those she'd known in New Orleans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cabin she shared with Arisa contained 2 rope beds, covered with cornhusk mattresses, 1 wooden table, and a small fireplace that provided inadequate heat during winter months when Texas cold could freeze water in buckets overnight. Their possessions fit into a single wooden crate, 2 spare dresses each, a comb they shared, a tin cup, and a small wooden cross that Arisa had carved from mesquite wood. But the physical dimensions of Nadira's world mattered less than the psychological boundaries that defined her existence. She woke before dawn to light fires in the main house. She spent her days moving between kitchen, parlor, and bedrooms, cleaning, mending, serving, always visible but never acknowledged as fully human. Her evenings belonged to Colleen, those sacred hours of grooming that had become both ritual and torture over 12 long years. Colleen Virith had been raised in Louisiana plantation society, where the management of enslaved people was considered an essential skill for women of her class. She learned from her mother and aunts the art of maintaining absolute control through a combination of periodic kindness and calculated cruelty. Random rewards kept people hoping. Strategic punishments kept them afraid. The combination created a psychological prison more effective than physical chains. The grooming ritual exemplified Colleen's approach. On the surface, it appeared almost intimate, these quiet evenings when mistress and maid occupied the same space in apparent peace. Colleen would sit at her vanity, and Nadira would stand behind her, brush in hand, working through the elaborate process of creating the braided styles that Colleen favored. Sometimes Colleen would talk, sharing gossip about neighbors or complaints about her husband's business decisions. These moments of apparent closeness made the cruelty that followed even more devastating, because Colleen's confidences were always weaponized later. Any comment Nadira made would be twisted and used against her. Any moment of relaxation would be punished for presumption. The grooming sessions were tests, designed to create false hope that would make subsequent humiliations more painful. Nadira had learned to keep silent during these sessions, responding only when directly questioned, offering no opinions, showing no personality beyond the subservient mask that survival required. She'd trained herself to think of the ritual as a performance, herself as an actress playing a role. The real Nadira, the woman who remembered her mother's face and dreamed of freedom, retreated somewhere deep inside, where Colleen couldn't reach. But 12 years of this performance had required a cost that Nadira was only beginning to calculate. She'd become someone who could smile while being insulted, who could thank her tormentor for permission to sleep, who could braid hair with gentle fingers while imagining those same fingers wrapped around Colleen's throat. The household staff at Blackwood Estate numbered 14 in total. 6 worked in the main house, Nadira and Arisa as ladies' maids, 2 in the kitchen, 1 managing the household supplies, 1 serving as butler and general overseer. 8 more worked the grounds, tending livestock, maintaining buildings, and managing the cotton fields that supplemented Ashton's cattle income. These 14 people had formed their own community within captivity, supporting each other through shared meals in the quarters behind the main house, through whispered conversations after the Vireths had retired for the evening, through the small acts of kindness that made survival possible. They'd developed their own code, their own hierarchy, their own methods of resistance that remained invisible to their captors. Maxwell Hart served as butler, a position that gave him access to the entire house and insight into the Vireths' affairs. He was 43, had been with Ashton since the estate's founding and had earned enough trust to handle money and conduct business in town. His literacy, secretly acquired through years of careful observation, allowed him to read documents that revealed the family's true financial situation. Sienna Elliott ran the kitchen with efficiency that kept the household functioning. She was 36, had been sold away from 3 previous families, and had learned to read people's intentions through decades of survival. Her cooking was excellent enough to make her valuable, her demeanor submissive enough to avoid suspicion, and her network of contacts in San Antonio extensive enough to gather information about safe routes north. Cora Lawrence managed the household supplies, which meant she knew exactly what came in and what went out, what was purchased and what was sold, what the family could afford and what they pretended to afford. She was 28, had been literate since before her enslavement, and kept careful mental records of every transaction that passed through Blackwood Estate. These 3, along with Nadira, formed the core of the household's hidden resistance. They shared information during brief encounters in hallways or storage rooms. They coordinated their testimonies when questioned about missing items or unexplained events. They protected each other through strategic timing and convenient memory lapses. Most importantly, they'd been preparing for the day when opportunity and necessity would align to create a chance for something beyond mere survival. Erisa represented the next generation of this resistance. At 14, she'd been born into slavery on a Louisiana plantation, sold twice before arriving at Blackwood Estate 3 years ago. Nadira had taken her under protection immediately, recognizing in the girl's fierce intelligence and quick adaptability the potential for something greater than what their current circumstances allowed. The relationship between Nadira and Erisa had evolved beyond the practical bonds of shared quarters. They'd become family in the way that enslaved people created kinship networks to replace the blood relations stolen by sale and separation. Nadira taught Erisa everything she knew about survival, reading situations, and maintaining the careful balance between obedience and dignity. Erisa, in turn, reminded Nadira that hope still existed, that the future might hold possibilities beyond endless servitude. The leather-bound ledger sat on Ashton Virith's mahogany desk like a coiled rattlesnake, innocuous until examined closely. Nadira had been cleaning the study on September 11, 1852, following her usual routine of dusting furniture, emptying ashtrays, and organizing papers that Ashton left scattered across every surface. The room smelled of tobacco and whiskey, masculine scents that marked this space as forbidden territory where she entered only for necessary work. Ashton had left that morning for a 3-day cattle drive to Austin, departing before dawn with instructions that his study be thoroughly cleaned during his absence. Cullen had supervised Nadira's entry into the room, watching with suspicious eyes as if expecting theft, before returning to her own concerns in the parlor. The mistress never stayed long in the study. She found its disorder distasteful, and preferred her own perfectly maintained spaces. Nadira worked methodically, as she'd been trained to do over 12 years of service. Dust the books on the shelves, careful not to disturb their arrangement. Clean the windows until glass disappeared into clarity. Polish the desk's surface, moving papers carefully to maintain whatever system Ashton imagined he was following. It was during this process that the ledger fell open, disturbed by her cleaning cloth, revealing columns of figures and descriptions that most enslaved people wouldn't have been able to read. But Nadira had been listening and learning for 12 years. Every time the Viriths tutored their son before sending him east to school, Nadira had been nearby, absorbing lessons meant for someone else. Every newspaper Ashton left scattered around the house became her textbook, studied during stolen moments when she could be certain of privacy. Every document she encountered during her cleaning duties was an opportunity to expand her understanding of the world that controlled her fate. The ledger contained household accounts dating back 6 months, income from cattle sales, expenses for supplies and equipment, payments to merchants in San Antonio, but it was the section titled Asset Management that made Nadira's hands freeze on the page. Listed there, in Ashton's cramped handwriting, were the names of everyone held in bondage at Blackwood Estate, along with their estimated values and notations about potential liquidation. Most entries were routine, annual updates of market values that Ashton maintained for insurance purposes. But 3 entries were marked differently, circled in red ink with dates attached. One had already been completed. Negro Jacob, field hand, age 26, sold July 15, 1852, $1, 100, to offset spring planting expenses. Jacob, who'd helped Nadira repair her cabin roof last winter. Jacob, who disappeared one morning with no explanation beyond Callan's cold statement that he'd been reassigned elsewhere. The second circled entry read, Negress Arissa, age 14, housemaid, estimated value $800, auction scheduled September 25th, New Orleans market. Expected proceeds to cover June cattle losses. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each letter a small blade cutting into Nadira's carefully maintained composure. The third entry was even more devastating. Negress Nadira, age 28, lady's maid, estimated value $1,200, auction scheduled October 10th, New Orleans market. Premium expected due to training and comportment. Nadira's vision narrowed to those lines of text. September 25th was 2 weeks away. October 10th gave her less than a month. Ashton had decided to liquidate them both, selling Arissa first to test the market, then following with Nadira to maximize profit. The notations indicated he'd already contacted brokers in New Orleans, had already negotiated commission rates, had already determined that their combined sale would cover his mounting debts from the failed cattle drive that spring. The calculation was purely financial. Ashton had invested in expanding his herd, anticipating strong prices at the Austin market. Instead, drought had reduced grass quality, and cattle arrived thin and less valuable than projected. Rather than accept reduced profit margins, he'd driven them to San Antonio, where prices were even worse. The losses had been substantial enough to threaten his ability to meet obligations to suppliers and creditors. His solution was elegant in its cruelty. Sell the most valuable household property, use the proceeds to settle immediate debts, and replace the lost labor with cheaper alternatives. Arissa and Nadira could bring $2,000 combined, enough to satisfy pressing creditors and maintain his reputation in San Antonio's business community. That they were human beings with connections, histories, and desires for their own futures never entered his equations. Nadira stood in the study for several minutes, the cleaning cloth forgotten in her hands, while her mind processed information that rewrote her entire understanding of her immediate future. She'd always known that sale was possible. Every enslaved person lived with that awareness, the knowledge that they were property that could be liquidated whenever their owners found it convenient. But she'd allowed herself to believe that her 12 years of faithful service had earned something resembling security. That belief shattered as she stared at the ledger entries. 12 years of suppressing her personality, of accepting humiliation, of braiding Colen's hair while swallowing rage meant absolutely nothing when measured against Ashton's financial needs. She was inventory to be sold when profit required it, nothing more. The notation about Arissa hurt even worse. The girl was only 14, still possessing the resilience that allowed her to find moments of joy despite their circumstances. New Orleans auctions were notorious for their brutality. Young women of Arissa's age were sold for specific purposes that had nothing to do with housework, and everything to do with exploitation that Nadira couldn't bear to contemplate in detail. Nadira carefully closed the ledger and returned it to its exact position on the desk. Her hands moved automatically through the remainder of her cleaning tasks, while her mind worked through calculations of a different sort. She had 2 weeks before Arissa would be taken, less than a month before her own sale. During that time, Ashton would finalize arrangements, contact buyers, and prepare transport to New Orleans. The entries indicated he'd already received initial interest from brokers. The sales would proceed unless something intervened to make them impossible. An accident that injured the property, reducing its value. An escape that removed it from his possession entirely. Or an event so catastrophic that it rendered the entire calculation irrelevant. That evening, Nadira performed the grooming ritual with mechanical precision, her fingers working through Colen's hair, while her mind explored possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider before. The mistress sat at her vanity, eyes closed in contentment, completely unaware that the woman braiding her hair was simultaneously planning her death. Because Nadira had reached a conclusion that 12 years of servitude had been preparing her for, she couldn't prevent the sales through appeal or negotiation. The Vireths had absolute legal authority over their human property. Courts wouldn't intervene. Law enforcement would assist in recovery if she attempted escape. The system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance she was contemplating. But the system assumed that enslaved people would choose survival over dignity, that they would accept any degradation rather than risk death. That assumption was about to be tested by a woman who discovered that some fates were worse than dying, and that watching Orissa led away to New Orleans auction blocks fell into that category. 3 days separated discovery from action. 72 hours during which Nadira moved through Blackwood Estate's routines with mechanical precision, while her mind worked through variables that would determine whether she lived as a free woman or died as a murderer. Every moment became an opportunity for observation, every interaction a chance to gather information, every routine task a rehearsal for what would come. September 11th through September 14th, 1852. These days would later be examined by investigators searching for signs of premeditation, for evidence that could transform murder from passion into calculated crime. What they would discover was a woman who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life, who'd learned through 12 years of servitude exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of people who believed themselves invincible. The first consideration was timing. Nadira had mapped the household rhythms with the precision of a military strategist. Ashton returned from his cattle drive on September 13th, exhausted and irritable from poor sales in Austin. He spent that evening drinking whiskey in his study, reviewing ledgers that confirmed his need to liquidate assets. Quellith avoided him during these moods, retreating to her bedroom early and demanding her usual grooming session to soothe nerves, frayed by her husband's financial failures. Nadira had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when Quellith would be most vulnerable. The mistress's cruelty increased when Ashton's business suffered. She took out her anxieties on the household staff through petty punishments and elaborate humiliations. But this stress also made her careless, so focused on maintaining appearances that she failed to notice changes in the people she considered beneath notice. During the grooming session on September 13th, Nadira tested her theory. She worked more slowly than usual, extending the ritual by several minutes while noting Quellith's responses. The mistress simply closed her eyes and leaned back, enjoying the extended pampering without questioning why Nadira had altered her usual efficient pace. This confirmed what Nadira suspected. Quellith's self-absorption created blind spots that could be exploited. The second consideration was the weapon itself. The pearl-handled scissors lived in Quellith's vanity drawer, alongside combs, brushes, and hairpins arranged with obsessive precision. Nadira had handled these scissors 6 evenings a week for 12 years, knew their weight and balance as intimately as she knew her own hands. The blades were German steel, kept sharp enough to cut through thick hair without pulling, sharp enough to pierce silk fabric or leather or flesh if applied with sufficient force and proper angle. On September 12th, while Quellith supervised household activities downstairs, Nadira took the scissors from their drawer and spent 5 minutes in careful examination. She tested the blade's edge against the hem of her dress, noting how little pressure was required to part the fabric's weave. She practiced the grip that would provide maximum control, adjusting her fingers until the handles settled into her palm with natural comfort. She rehearsed the motion that would be required, a downward arc from standing position behind the vanity chair, targeting the exposed throat of someone seated and relaxed. The scissors went back into their drawer in exactly the position Quellith expected. Nothing appeared disturbed. But Nadira had added this weapon to her mental inventory of tools that could transform intention into action. The third consideration involved the household staff, specifically the 3 people who formed her closest alliance. Maxwell Hart, Sienna Elliott, and Cora Lawrence needed to understand what was coming without being told explicitly. Direct conspiracy would endanger them if investigations followed, but strategic positioning could ensure they were nowhere near the scene when violence occurred, creating alibis that would protect them from suspicion. Nadira began this process on September 12th during the brief evening meal that staff shared in the kitchen after the Quelliths had finished dining. Conversation was usually minimal, everyone too exhausted from 16-hour workdays to engage in extended discussion. But Nadira broke her usual silence with carefully chosen words. "Orissa and I will be handling all bedroom duties for the next few days," she announced, her tone casual but firm. "Mistress Quellith wants continuity while she's planning the autumn social calendar. Maxwell, you'll focus on the study and parlor. Sienna, kitchen work only. Cora, the storage rooms need full inventory before month's end." The instructions were unusual, but not unprecedented. Quellith occasionally demanded exclusive service from specific staff members during periods of particular stress. What made these assignments significant was their effect. They would ensure that Maxwell, Sienna, and Cora were occupied in locations far from the master bedroom during evening hours. They would have no reason to be upstairs, no opportunity to witness whatever happened in Colin's private chambers. Maxwell caught Nadira's eye across the rough wooden table where they ate. Something in her expression made him pause mid-bite, studying her face with a careful attention that 12 years of survival had taught him. He saw something there that made him nod slowly, asking no questions, accepting the assignment without comment. Sienna's response was equally telling. She reached across the table and squeezed Nadira's hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity that lasted only a moment before she returned to her meal. The touch communicated understanding without requiring words. Whatever was coming, Sienna would be ready to support it through strategic ignorance. Cora simply said, "The inventory will take several evenings to complete properly. I'll be in the storage rooms from supper until late each night." The statement was both acceptance of assignment and alibi preparation, creating a documented reason for her absence from the main house during crucial hours. Only Arissa seemed confused by these arrangements, her young face showing concern at being excluded from the unspoken communication passing between the adults. Nadira would need to handle Arissa separately, would need to ensure the girl's safety without revealing details that might endanger her if questioned later. The fourth consideration was Arissa herself. Nadira spent September 13th teaching the girls skills that seemed disconnected from their usual routines. How to navigate San Antonio streets after dark, where the Quaker meeting house stood on the eastern edge of town, which households were known to help people traveling north toward free territories. The lessons were disguised as general knowledge, information that any enslaved person might find useful someday. "Why are you telling me this now?" Arissa asked as they prepared the master bedroom for evening on September 13th, her intuition sensing something unusual in Nadira's urgency. "Because knowledge is freedom," Nadira replied, smoothing wrinkles from Colin's bedding with practiced efficiency. "Even when our bodies are trapped, our minds can prepare for opportunities that might come unexpectedly." Arissa absorbed this lesson with the quick intelligence that made her both valuable and vulnerable. She was smart enough to understand that something significant was approaching, wise enough not to ask questions that might receive answers she wasn't ready to hear. The fifth consideration involved escape routes, though not for the reasons that investigators would later assume. Nadira had no intention of fleeing Blackwood Estate. Her plan required acceptance of consequences, rather than avoidance. But she needed to ensure that Arissa could disappear immediately after violence occurred, could vanish into San Antonio's hidden networks before anyone thought to secure her as witness or property. On September 14th, the day that would end with Colin's death, Nadira gave Arissa specific instructions disguised as routine tasks. "After you finish the laundry, take the mending to the Quaker household on Commerce Street. Mrs. Kendall Harper has requested our best work on her daughter's wedding dress. The task will require several hours, so inform cook you'll miss evening meal." The instructions were fabricated entirely. There was no wedding dress, no request from the Quaker household. But the errand would place Arissa in the care of known abolitionists at exactly the moment when Colin died, would create a documented reason for her absence that had nothing to do with violence or conspiracy. Arissa accepted the assignment without question, pleased to be given responsibility that took her beyond the estate's boundaries. She left at 4 o'clock that afternoon carrying a basket of mending that Nadira had carefully prepared, walking toward a future she didn't yet understand was being purchased with blood. The final consideration was psychological preparation. Nadira had never killed anyone, had never raised her hand in violence despite 12 years of provocation. The transformation from victim to executioner required reconciling her self-image with actions that would define her for whatever time remained in her life. She spent the afternoon of September 14th in quiet contemplation, working through the moral calculations that would allow her to commit murder without destroying herself in the process. She thought about her mother, sold away when Nadira was 10 years old, disappearing into the vast machinery of slavery's internal trade. She thought about every person she'd watched, broken by this system, every spirit crushed beneath the weight of absolute powerlessness. She thought about Arissa being led onto an auction block in New Orleans, examined like livestock by men whose intentions would steal whatever innocence the girl had managed to preserve. She thought about her own sale, about spending whatever years remained to her in service to new owners who might be worse than the Viriths, starting over in a place where she'd built no alliances and accumulated no small advantages. And she thought about Kalen Vireth, who'd spent 12 years treating Nadira as an object rather than a person, who'd used intimacy as a weapon and kindness as a tool for manipulation, who'd decided that selling Arissa and Nadira was simply a business decision that required no more moral consideration than selling furniture. By the time evening approached on September 14th, Nadira had achieved the cold clarity that violence requires. She understood exactly what she was about to do, why she was doing it, and what consequences would follow. She'd made peace with trading her future for Arissa's chance at something better. She'd accepted that justice sometimes required sacrifices that law would call murder. The grooming ritual began at 7 o'clock, just as it had 6 evenings a week for 12 years. But this time Nadira picked up the pearl-handled scissors, knowing they would serve a purpose beyond cutting hair. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across Kalen Vireth's bedroom as Nadira began the evening ritual that would end in death. 7 o'clock on September 14, 1852, and the texture of routine felt different now that Nadira understood this would be the final performance of a role she'd been playing for 12 years. Every gesture carried additional weight. Every movement became part of a sequence leading to irreversible action. Colleen sat at her vanity wearing a white silk nightgown that had cost more than most families earned in a month. Her auburn hair hung loose down her back, released from the day's elaborate styling and ready for the evening's transformation. The mirror reflected both women, mistress and maid, captor and captive, the condemned and her executioner, though only one of them understood which role belonged to whom. "You're quiet this evening," Kalen observed, studying Nadira's reflection with the casual attention she might give to furniture arrangement. "Has something disturbed you?" The question carried layers of meaning that Kalen herself didn't recognize. Yes, something had disturbed Nadira profoundly. The discovery that 12 years of faithful service had earned exactly nothing, that she and Arissa were simply inventory to be liquidated when profit required it. But Kalen asked without expecting honest answer, without imagining that the woman standing behind her possessed thoughts complex enough to be called disturbed. "No, mistress," Nadira replied, her voice carrying the submissive tone that 12 years had perfected. "I'm simply focused on creating the style you requested." She began with the brushing, long strokes from scalp to ends that Colleen found soothing. 100 strokes, the same number every evening, a meditation that relaxed the mistress into the vulnerable state that Nadira required. The brush moved through auburn hair with practiced rhythm, while Nadira's mind counted down toward the moment when routine would shatter into violence. Kalen's eyes drifted closed around stroke 30, her shoulders dropping as tension released. This was the pattern Nadira had observed for 12 years, the predictable response to stimulation that Kalen found pleasurable. The mistress became almost meditative during these sessions, her guard dropping as she sank into the sensory experience of being tended. "Ashton is planning another cattle drive next month," Kalen murmured, her voice drowsy with relaxation. "He thinks better prices in Houston will recover our losses. I told him he's a fool to risk more capital on his poor judgment, but he never listens to sense." Nadira made appropriate sounds of acknowledgement while continuing the rhythmic brushing. Stroke 50, stroke 60. Each pass of the brush brought her closer to the moment when she would exchange this tool for another, when she would stop serving and start settling accounts that had been accumulating for 12 years. "I've been considering changes to the household staff," Kalen continued, apparently finding comfort in sharing thoughts with someone she considered incapable of judgment or opinion. "Some of the help has become too familiar, too comfortable. A fresh start might improve efficiency." The statement was Kalen's way of referencing the planned sales without acknowledging them directly. She wouldn't tell Nadira about the decision to auction her and Arissa. That information would be delivered at the last possible moment, maximizing shock and minimizing time for resistance. Kalen had used this approach before, had refined the cruelty of sudden separation into a tool for maintaining absolute control. But her casual mention of changes confirmed what Nadira had learned from the ledger. The sales were definite. Kalen had approved them, perhaps had even suggested them to Ashton as solution to their financial problems. The mistress felt no guilt about destroying the small stability that Nadira and Arissa had built within their captivity. She simply viewed it as necessary adjustment to household management. Nadira reached stroke 100 and set the brush aside. Her hands were steady as she picked up the bottle of lavender oil that Kalen preferred for scalp massage. 3 drops into her palm, rubbed together to warm the oil, then applied with firm circular motions that made Colin sigh with contentment. This was the most vulnerable moment in the entire ritual. Colin's eyes remained closed, her neck exposed and relaxed, her attention focused entirely on the sensation of Nadira's fingers working across her scalp. For 5 minutes, the mistress existed in a state approaching trust, believing herself safe in the hands of someone she'd spent 12 years teaching to fear her. Nadira worked the oil through Colin's hair with fingers that had performed this service thousands of times. She knew every sensitive spot, every pressure point that made the mistress sigh or lean into the touch. She used this knowledge now with deliberate calculation, extending the massage until Colin reached a state of deep relaxation that bordered on sleep. "That's perfect," Colin murmured, her voice thick with pleasure. "You do have some uses beyond basic service." The casual insult, delivered in a moment of vulnerability, crystallized everything Nadira had been feeling for 3 days. Colin couldn't even accept care without diminishing the person providing it, couldn't experience service without asserting superiority. Even now, relaxed and defenseless, she needed to remind Nadira of her place in their hierarchy. Nadira's hand stilled in Colin's hair. The moment had arrived. She could continue the massage, finish the braiding, complete another evening of ritual servitude, and wake tomorrow to the same routines. Or she could reach into the vanity drawer, retrieve the pearl-handled scissors, and transform this moment into something that would echo through generations. Her right hand moved toward the drawer, with motion so smooth that Colin noticed nothing unusual. The mistress's eyes remained closed, her breathing deep and even, her body language radiating the false security of someone who'd never imagined that the hands in her hair might belong to an enemy. The drawer slid open soundlessly. Nadira's fingers closed around the familiar handles of the scissors. German steel, sharp enough to cut through anything, heavy enough to provide the momentum that precision required. She lifted them from the drawer, with the same casual grace she'd use for any grooming tool. Colin's eyes opened slightly, catching Nadira's reflection in the mirror. For just a moment, their gazes met in the glass. Colin saw Nadira holding scissors in an unusual grip, saw something in her maid's expression that penetrated even the mistress's self-absorption. Recognition flickered across Colin's face, the first real seeing of Nadira as a person rather than property, the first genuine fear of someone she'd tormented for 12 years. "What are you doing?" Colin's voice carried confusion rather than alarm, her mind unable to process the threat even as it manifested in her reflection. Nadira didn't answer with words. Her arm descended in a smooth arc that 12 years of suppressed rage had been preparing for. The scissors, sharp points, found Colin's throat with surgical precision, piercing the soft flesh above the collarbone, severing the carotid artery exactly as Nadira had visualized during 3 days of mental rehearsal. The sound was surprisingly quiet, a wet whisper as steel parted skin and muscle, a gurgling gasp as Colin's breath caught on blood flooding her windpipe. The mistress's hands flew to her throat in reflexive defense, but the damage was already complete. Blood welled between her fingers, dark and thick, spreading across the white silk nightgown in patterns that resembled roses blooming. Colin's eyes, wide with shock and dawning comprehension, met Nadira's in the mirror one final time. The mistress's mouth opened as if to scream or speak, but only blood emerged. Her body jerked in the vanity chair, muscles spasming as her brain registered the catastrophic injury as her nervous system began the process of shutting down. Nadira stood motionless behind the chair, the scissors still gripped in her right hand, watching as Colin Verith died. The woman who'd controlled every aspect of Nadira's existence for 12 years was reduced to gasping breaths and weakening movements, powerless for the first time in their relationship. The transformation took less than a minute from first cut to final breath. Blood pooled on the vanity's surface, soaking into Colin's carefully arranged beauty products and expensive perfumes. It dripped onto the Persian rug beneath the chair, staining the intricate patterns that had been imported from halfway around the world. It painted the white silk nightgown in expanding circles that looked almost artistic in the lamplight. Colin's final breath emerged as a wet rattle around 7:14 in the evening. Her eyes remained open, staring at her reflection in the mirror, as if death had come so suddenly that even her body didn't understand it was over. Her hand stayed pressed against her throat, fingers still trying futilely to stem blood that had already stopped flowing. Nadira released the scissors, letting them fall onto the carpet with a soft thud. Her hands were steady, despite what she'd just done. Her breathing remained even. She felt no satisfaction, no horror, no emotional response beyond the cold clarity of someone who'd completed a necessary task. Cullen v. Retta was dead. Erisa would not be sold to New Orleans. The ledger entries had been rendered meaningless by violence that transformed property into person capable of ultimate resistance. The bedroom door remained closed, just as it always did during the grooming ritual. Beyond that door, Blackwood Estate continued its evening routines. Ashton sat in his study, reviewing financial documents that no longer mattered. Maxwell served in the parlor, maintaining the fiction of normalcy. Sienna worked in the kitchen, preparing tomorrow's bread. Cora completed inventory in storage rooms far from the main house. And somewhere in San Antonio, Erisa sat safely in the Quaker household on Commerce Street, protected by people who would ensure she disappeared into networks that led north toward territories where freedom meant something more than legal fiction. Yochas. Nadira walked calmly to the bedroom door, opened it, just wide enough to slip through, and closed it behind her. She descended the back stairs that led to the servants' quarters, moving with the same purposeful grace she'd displayed for 12 years. When she reached the cabin she'd shared with Erisa, she sat down on the rough wooden stool and waited for consequences she'd accepted 3 days earlier when she discovered the ledger entries that sentenced them both to sale. She didn't attempt escape, didn't try to hide evidence or create alibis. She simply waited, hands folded in her lap, for the moment when someone would discover Cullen's body and come looking for the woman who'd been alone with the mistress during her final moments. Justice, Nadira understood, sometimes required sacrifices that survival instincts rejected. She'd chosen Erisa's freedom over her own life. She'd chosen dignity over escape. She'd chosen to make Ashton Virith accountable for treating human beings as inventory by removing his most valuable possession in a way that couldn't be disguised as business transaction. The discovery came at 7:43 in the evening when Ashton Virith climbed the stairs to his wife's bedroom, irritated that she hadn't appeared for their customary after-dinner coffee in the parlor. He'd been working through financial projections that confirmed his need to proceed with the planned sales, calculating how the $2,000 from liquidating Nadira and Erisa would stabilize his immediate obligations, while he arranged more profitable cattle drives to Houston markets. His knock on the bedroom door received no response, unusual, but not unprecedented. Colleen sometimes fell asleep during her grooming rituals, exhausted by the emotional labor of managing a household and maintaining social appearances in San Antonio's demanding society. Ashton opened the door expecting to find his wife drowsing at her vanity, perhaps needing gentle wakening to discuss the week's social calendar. Instead, he found carnage that would haunt his nightmares for whatever years remained in his life. Cullen sat motionless in her vanity chair, head tilted forward at an unnatural angle, white nightgown transformed into abstract art painted with blood that had already begun to darken and congeal. The smell hit him immediately, the metallic tang of massive blood loss mixed with the lavender oil that Nadira had worked through Cullen's hair minutes before killing her. Ashton's shout brought Maxwell Hart running from the parlor, where the butler had been maintaining his assigned duties with careful attention to creating documented presence far from the scene of violence. Maxwell's expression showed appropriate shock as he assessed the situation, his eyes taking in details that would later prove crucial to understanding exactly what had occurred in this room. "Get Sheriff Connor Blake," Ashton commanded, his voice shaking with a combination of rage and disbelief. "Tell him my wife has been murdered. Tell him to bring deputies and a physician. And find that woman Nadira immediately. She was the last person with my wife." Maxwell departed with suitable urgency, though his route to town took him past the servants' quarters where he paused just long enough to confirm that Nadira sat waiting in her cabin, exactly as she'd planned. The brief eye contact they shared communicated volumes without requiring words. She was ready, he understood. The story they'd been preparing to tell for years would now be tested against a legal system designed to deny enslaved people every form of justice. Sheriff Connor Blake arrived at Blackwood Estate at 8:17 in the evening, accompanied by 2 deputies and Dr. Dominic Shaw, whose medical expertise would be required to document cause of death and gather evidence for the inevitable trial. The 40-minute gap between discovery and official response would later become a source of speculation, though no investigation would adequately explain why it took so long for law enforcement to respond to a murder in one of the county's most prominent households. The truth was simpler than conspiracy. Maxwell had taken a deliberately circuitous route to town, stopping briefly at 3 different locations to ensure that certain information reached certain people before official proceedings began. The Quaker household on Commerce Street learned that Arisa needed to disappear immediately into networks that could move her north. The African Methodist Episcopal Church received notice that one of their community had struck a blow that would require support and documentation. And a free black woman who ran a boarding house near the river was informed that testimony might be needed about the Virith family's treatment of their human property. These 40 minutes allowed strategic positioning that would prove crucial during subsequent legal proceedings. By the time Sheriff Blake examined Colleen's body, multiple witnesses had already been prepared to testify about patterns of abuse that newspapers would try desperately to ignore. Dr. Shaw's preliminary examination revealed details that complicated the straightforward narrative of slave rebellion that Ashton desperately wanted to establish. The wound was precise, delivered by someone with significant knowledge of human anatomy. A single cut severing the carotid artery with minimal damage to surrounding tissue. The angle suggested careful planning rather than frenzied attack, intelligence rather than savage impulse. This wasn't the work of someone overcome by passion, Shaw noted in his initial report, speaking quietly to Sheriff Blake while Ashton paced the hallway outside. The perpetrator understood exactly where to strike for maximum efficiency. We're looking at calculated execution, not spontaneous violence. The distinction would prove crucial during trial, though not in ways that Dr. Shaw anticipated. Evidence of premeditation typically increased sentences in murder cases. But when the accused was enslaved property and the victim was a slaveholder, premeditation could be reframed as evidence of intelligence and moral reasoning that the legal system claimed enslaved people didn't possess. The murder weapon lay on the carpet where Nadira had dropped it, pearl handles gleaming in lamplight that had witnessed Colleen's final moments. The scissors bore traces of blood, but no fingerprints, having been wiped clean with the same mechanical precision that characterized the killing itself. Shaw cataloged this evidence with professional detachment, noting that the weapon belonged to the household's grooming supplies and had been used regularly for its intended purpose, before being repurposed for homicide. Sheriff Blake began interviewing household staff at 8:45, starting with Maxwell Hart, whose position as butler gave him comprehensive knowledge of household operations and access to information about family dynamics. Maxwell's testimony would establish patterns that other witnesses would reinforce, creating a narrative that contradicted Ashton's preferred version of events. Master Ashton had been discussing financial difficulties for several weeks, Maxwell stated, his voice steady and his eyes properly downcast in the manner that white authorities expected from enslaved people. I heard him tell Mistress Quellith that they needed to liquidate certain assets to cover debts from the failed cattle drive last spring. He specifically mentioned selling Nadira and the young girl Arisa to New Orleans markets. The testimony was accurate but strategically incomplete. Maxwell failed to mention overhearing the exact dates of planned sales. He omitted details about Ashton's gambling debts that had compounded legitimate business losses. He forgot to recall specific conversations about selling Arisa despite Nadira's pleading for the girl to be spared. His memory had developed convenient gaps that allowed him to provide useful information without appearing to possess knowledge that might implicate him in conspiracy. Sienna Elliott provided similar testimony when questioned in the kitchen where she'd been working during the murder. She'd been preparing tomorrow's bread and heard nothing unusual until Ashton's shouting brought her attention to the crisis upstairs. But she remembered Mistress Colleen's habit of discussing household sales as if they were furniture transactions rather than family separations. She recalled the mistress's casual cruelty toward staff members, the punishments delivered for minor infractions, the atmosphere of fear that characterized daily life at Blackwood Estate. Did Nadira ever express anger toward Mistress Quellith? Blake asked, searching for evidence of motive that would support simple narratives about dangerous slaves. Nadira never expressed anything, Sienna replied carefully. She was the quietest person in this household. Did her work without complaint, kept her thoughts to herself, caused no trouble in 12 years of service. The answer was technically truthful while obscuring deeper realities. Nadira's silence had been survival strategy, not natural temperament. Her apparent compliance had masked careful observation and strategic planning. But Sienna's testimony suggested someone incapable of the calculation required for premeditated murder, creating cognitive dissonance that might benefit Nadira during trial. Cora Lawrence, questioned while conducting inventory in storage rooms that established her alibi far from the murder scene, provided the most damaging testimony about the Wielding family's treatment of their human property. She detailed sales that had separated families over the past 5 years. She described Callan's habit of using sale threats as punishment for perceived infractions. She explained the household's understanding that financial difficulties inevitably resulted in people disappearing to auction blocks in New Orleans or Houston. "Did you know that Master Ashton planned to sell Nadira and Arissa?" Blake asked. "Everyone knew," Cora replied simply. "That's how it works here. When money gets tight, people get sold. We all understood that our value was measured in dollars, not humanity." The statement hung in the air of the storage room, indicting an entire system while appearing to simply describe household operations. Blake wrote it down in his notes, not recognizing that he was documenting evidence that would later be used to establish justification for violence the law couldn't officially condone. At 9:30, Sheriff Blake made his way to the servants' quarters where he expected to find evidence of hasty flight or desperate preparation for escape. The cabin Nadira shared with Arissa measured 12 feet by 10, furnished with minimal possessions that spoke of lives lived in enforced poverty. But what struck Blake immediately was Nadira's calm as she sat waiting on a wooden stool, hands folded in her lap, expression revealing neither fear nor defiance. "You know why I'm here," Blake stated, studying this woman who'd just committed murder and made no attempt to escape consequences. "I know," Nadira replied, her voice carrying the same steady quality that had characterized her testimony to household investigators. "I killed Callan Virith. I used the scissors from her vanity. I did it while we were alone during the evening grooming ritual. I'm ready to accept whatever judgment you deliver." The confession was comprehensive and immediate, requiring no interrogation or coercion, but it was also strategically constructed, providing facts while omitting the emotional context that might humanize her actions or complicate the legal proceedings that would follow. Nadira understood that her best chance at influencing outcome lay in controlling narrative, in presenting herself as rational actor rather than emotional victim. "Why did you do it?" Blake asked, the question emerging from genuine curiosity rather than investigative procedure. Nadira's answer would be quoted in newspapers from San Antonio to New Orleans, interpreted according to each publication's relationship to the slavery system. "Because Master Ashton was going to sell me and Arissa like livestock to cover his gambling debts. Because Mistress Colleen approved this decision without considering that we were human beings with connections and desires for our own futures. Because 12 years of faithful service earned exactly nothing when measured against their financial convenience." She paused, meeting Blake's eyes with directness that violated every social convention about how enslaved people should interact with white authority. "I killed her because the system you enforce left me no other option to protect someone I love. And I'm prepared to die for making that choice, but I want it recorded that I don't regret the action itself, only that your world made it necessary." The statement was revolutionary in its clarity, acknowledging guilt while asserting moral justification that the legal system wasn't designed to recognize. Blake found himself unsettled by this woman's composure, by her willingness to accept consequences while simultaneously indicting the entire social order that had produced this violence. Blake's examination of the cabin revealed evidence that would prove crucial during trial. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, investigators discovered documents that Nadira had been collecting for years. Ashton's ledgers detailing sales of other enslaved people from Blackwood Estate, notes about Callan's cruelties toward household staff, records of gambling debts and failed business ventures that explained the family's mounting financial pressures. Most significantly, the torn remnants of the bill of sale that would have sent Arissa to New Orleans auction blocks. "You've been planning this," Blake observed, studying documents that revealed systematic documentation of abuse and exploitation. "I've been surviving," Nadira corrected. "Planning implies I had choices. What I had was the knowledge that eventually survival would require action that your laws call murder but any mother would recognize as protection." Blake also discovered Nadira's small savings, $37 in coins accumulated over years of selling eggs from chickens she'd raised during whatever spare time her servitude allowed. The money sat in a wooden box beside a letter addressed to Arissa, sealed but not hidden, intended to be found and delivered after Nadira's execution. "You can read that if you want," Nadira offered, gesturing toward the letter. "It explains to Arissa why I made this choice. It tells her that love sometimes demands prices that seem unbearable, but are actually evidence of how much someone matters." Blake didn't open the letter, some instinct telling him that its contents were private communication between people whose relationship he couldn't begin to understand, despite years of living in a society built on slavery. He sealed it as evidence but noted in his report that it should be delivered to its intended recipient after legal proceedings concluded. The arrest occurred at 9:52 in the evening. Blake placed iron shackles on Nadira's wrists, the metal cold and heavy against skin that had never before been physically restrained. Throughout 12 years of enslavement, Nadira had never been chained. Her compliance had seemed absolute enough that physical restraints appeared unnecessary. Now those same hands that had braided hair and served meals and killed with surgical precision were bound in preparation for transport to the county jail, where she would await trial. As Blake led Nadira from the cabin, she paused to look back at the small space she'd shared with Arissa. 12 years of life reduced to a rope bed and a wooden crate, but also 12 years of whispered conversations, stolen moments of tenderness, and the fierce protection that had ultimately manifested in violence. She'd never see this place again, never share another evening with Arissa in the safety of their small refuge from the Virith household's demands. "Where is Arissa?" Blake asked as they walked toward his horse. "Safe," Nadira replied simply. "That's all that matters. She's somewhere that your laws can't reach her, somewhere that she can choose her own future instead of having it determined by ledger entries and auction blocks." The answer confirmed Blake's suspicion that other people had been involved in ensuring Arissa's disappearance, that the 40-minute delay before his arrival had allowed strategic movements that removed the girl from immediate danger. But he made no note of this in his official report, some part of him recognizing that whatever conspiracy had occurred served justice that the legal system couldn't provide. Word of the murder spread through San Antonio's enslaved community with remarkable speed. By the time Blake transported Nadira to the county jail at 10:30 that evening, small groups had begun gathering in discrete locations, discussing implications of violence that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and resistance. Nadira's name was already becoming legend, her story being shaped into teaching tool about the lengths to which maternal love would go when all other options disappeared. The Bexar County Courthouse dominated San Antonio's main plaza, a limestone structure that symbolized American legal authority imposed on land that had been Spanish, then Mexican, then Texan, and finally American within living memory. On October 3, 1852, 3 weeks after Kalen Viret's murder, this building became the stage for a trial that would test whether the legal system could handle a case where traditional categories of victim and perpetrator collapsed into moral complexity. 200 spectators crowded into a courtroom designed for half that number. The audience divided along predictable lines. Wealthy plantation owners demanding exemplary punishment to deter similar acts of rebellion. Abolitionists hoping to use Nadira's case to expose slavery's inherent violence. Free black citizens understanding that this trial would establish precedents affecting their own precarious status. And enslaved people who'd found ways to attend despite restrictions on their movement. Judge Eli Barrett presided, a man whose 40 years on the bench had taught him that law and justice frequently diverged, especially in cases involving the peculiar institution that defined Texas society. He understood that his decisions today would ripple across the South, affecting how plantation households managed their human property, and how enslaved people calculated the risks of resistance. The courthouse smelled of tobacco smoke and tension, the October heat pressing through tall windows that framed views of the plaza, where slave auctions occurred weekly. Armed deputies maintained order as crowds debated whether they were witnessing justice or dangerous precedent that might encourage rebellion across Texas. Prosecutor Hayden Burke opened with arguments designed to terrify property holders throughout the state. Nadira represented the savage nature barely contained by Christian instruction and benevolent management. A woman who'd betrayed 12 years of kind treatment with brutal violence that threatened the foundation of civilized society. His strategy was transparent. Portray the murder as unprovoked madness that required the harshest possible punishment to prevent contagion. "Gentlemen of the jury," Burke began, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom with practiced authority. "We are here to address an act of barbarism that strikes at the heart of social order. The defendant, despite receiving food, shelter, and Christian guidance for 12 years, repaid her benefactors with cold-blooded murder. If we allow such violence to go inadequately punished, we invite chaos into every household that depends on subordinate labor. Burke's language carefully avoided acknowledging slavery explicitly, instead using euphemisms like subordinate labor and household management that allowed him to discuss human bondage without confronting its moral implications. This rhetorical strategy reflected broader societal discomfort with examining too closely the system that produced cases like Nadira's. But Nadira's defense attorney, Weston Doyle, had spent 3 weeks building a case that would force the jury to examine exactly what they preferred to ignore. Doyle was a San Antonio lawyer with quiet abolitionist sympathies, who'd volunteered to represent Nadira after reading newspaper accounts that omitted crucial context about the Quellith household's operations. His investigation had uncovered evidence that transformed murder from crime into something approaching self-defense. "Gentlemen of the jury," Doyle began, his voice measured and calm, "we acknowledge that Nadira killed Quellith. She has confessed to this act without evasion or excuse, but we ask you to consider whether her actions constituted murder or the desperate act of someone protecting their family from destruction, sanctioned by law but repugnant to human decency." The distinction would prove revolutionary. Doyle's strategy wasn't to deny the killing, but to establish context that reframed it from criminal act to moral necessity. He intended to put the slavery system itself on trial, using Nadira's case to expose contradictions between legal authority and human rights. Doyle's first witness shocked everyone present, Ashton Quellith himself, compelled by subpoena to testify about his household management and financial situation. The widower had expected to deliver victim impact testimony about his devastating loss. Instead, he found himself subjected to questions that revealed uncomfortable truths about how he'd treated the people he held in bondage. "Mr. Quellith, did you plan to sell Nadira and a girl named Arisa to cover business debts?" Doyle asked, his tone respectful but persistent. "That was under consideration," Ashton replied carefully. "Business reversals sometimes require liquidating assets to maintain solvency." "When you refer to liquidating assets, you mean selling human beings?" "I mean managing property according to legal rights and economic necessity." "Did Nadira know about your plans to sell her and Arisa?" Ashton hesitated, recognizing the trap but unable to avoid it without committing perjury. "I don't know what household staff knew or didn't know. Such decisions weren't their concern." Doyle produced the ledger that Blake had confiscated from Nadira's cabin, the pages marked with Ashton's handwriting detailing planned sales and estimated values. "Is this your ledger? Is this your notation indicating that Nadira and Arisa would be auctioned in New Orleans to cover losses from failed cattle ventures?" The courtroom fell silent as Ashton confirmed the document's authenticity. Doyle had established the catalyst for violence, while forcing Ashton to acknowledge treating human beings as mere financial instruments. Burke objected repeatedly, arguing that Ashton's property management wasn't on trial, but Judge Barrett allowed the testimony to continue. The precedent would prove crucial for subsequent witnesses who would provide even more damaging revelations about the Quellith household's operations. Maxwell Hart took the stand next, his testimony carefully calibrated to appear cooperative while revealing systematic patterns of abuse. He described Quellith's habit of using sale threats as punishment, her practice of separating people who'd formed emotional bonds as entertainment, her casual cruelty disguised as household discipline. "Did you ever witness Mistress Quellith physically strike Nadira or other household staff?" Doyle asked. "Regularly," Maxwell replied. "Mistress Quellith believed that periodic violence maintained proper discipline. She would strike people with whatever object was convenient, riding crops, kitchen utensils, fireplace pokers, for infractions real or imagined." Burke's cross-examination attempted to discredit Maxwell's testimony by emphasizing his status as enslaved property with potential motivation to lie. But Maxwell's calm demeanor and specific details about incidents that could be corroborated through household records made his testimony difficult to dismiss. Sienna Elliott followed, providing testimony about Quellith's psychological cruelty that complemented Maxwell's accounts of physical violence. She described how the mistress would promise rewards for good service, then find reasons to withhold them at the last moment. How Quellith would confide in Nadira during grooming sessions, then punish her later for presuming familiarity. how the household lived in constant fear of provoking the mistress's unpredictable rage. In your observation, did Nadira show signs of hatred toward Mistress Quellith before the murder? Doyle asked. Nadira showed nothing, Sienna replied. She was the most controlled person I've ever known. She did her work perfectly, kept her thoughts private, and gave no indication of what she felt about anything. Looking back, I realized that level of control required extraordinary strength and probably came at terrible cost. Cora Lawrence's testimony proved most damaging to prosecution narratives. She detailed 5 separate sales from Blackwood Estate over the past 3 years, each triggered by Ashton's financial miscalculations, and each approved by Callanan without consideration for the families being destroyed. She explained how the household understood that human connections meant nothing when measured against profit requirements. Most significantly, Cora testified about discovering Nadira reading the ledger entry that detailed plans to sell her and Arissa. She didn't cry or rage, Cora stated. She simply went very still, like something inside her had transformed from living tissue into stone. I knew in that moment that something irreversible had been set in motion. Burke attempted to establish that this testimony proved premeditation, that Nadira had spent 3 days planning murder rather than acting from sudden passion. But Doyle reframed the same evidence as showing rational decision-making by someone facing impossible choices, someone who'd carefully weighed options and concluded that violence was the only path that protected someone she loved. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Doyle called Dr. Dominic Shaw to discuss his medical findings. Shaw's examination of Colleen's body had revealed evidence that complicated simple narratives about victim and perpetrator. The wound was surgically precise, delivered by someone with significant anatomical knowledge. But Shaw had also found evidence on Colleen's body that told a different story than newspapers had reported. Dr. Shaw, did your examination of Mrs. Quellith reveal any other injuries besides the fatal wound? Doyle asked. Yes, Shaw replied carefully. I found old scarring on her knuckles consistent with repeatedly striking hard objects or persons, bruising on her forearms suggesting recent altercations, and arthritis in her hands that would have made certain activities painful. What activities? Activities requiring fine motor control, such as needlework, writing, or striking people with precision. The testimony suggested that Quellith had been physically violent even when it caused her own pain, that her cruelty had been deliberate rather than impulsive. Combined with a witness testimony about systematic abuse, it created a picture of someone whose treatment of enslaved people went beyond legal authority into pathological behavior. Burke's closing argument attempted to refocus attention on the crime itself rather than the context that produced it. He emphasized that Nadira had confessed to premeditated murder, that she'd shown no remorse, that allowing such violence to receive anything less than maximum punishment would encourage rebellion throughout Texas and beyond. The defendant asks you to consider her feelings, her relationships, her fears about being sold, Burke argued. But these emotional appeals cannot excuse taking human life. If we accept that enslaved people can murder their owners whenever they disapprove of management decisions, we invite anarchy that will destroy the social order our ancestors built. The argument revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of slavery. The system required treating people as property, while simultaneously fearing them as human beings capable of resistance. Burke wanted the jury to punish Nadira for being property that acted like a person, for asserting human connections that the law claimed she didn't possess. Doyle's closing argument would be remembered long after the trial ended. He stood before the jury with none of Burke's theatrical flourish, simply a lawyer asking 12 men to examine their own consciences while applying law that explicitly denied humanity to people like Nadira. Gentlemen, we ask you to consider what any parent would do to protect their family from destruction. Nadira had no legal recourse, no appeal to authority, no protection except her own courage. She discovered that the people who claimed to own her planned to sell her and someone she loved like livestock. She calculated that killing one person who approved this sale was preferable to watching passively as her family was destroyed for profit. Doyle paused, letting the words settle over a courtroom that had fallen completely silent. Texas law defines Nadira as property without rights to family, to self-determination, to justice. But that same law charges her with murder, implying she possesses moral agency and emotional bonds that property cannot have. You cannot have it both ways. Either Nadira is property without capacity for murder, or she is a person whose actions must be judged according to the impossible situation that law itself created. The logical trap was elegant and devastating. If the jury convicted Nadira of murder, they acknowledged her humanity. If they acknowledged her humanity, they had to consider whether her actions were justified by circumstances that would excuse violence from any parent protecting their family. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before reaching a verdict that satisfied no one and terrified everyone who understood its implications. The foreman's voice trembled as he delivered words that would reshape how Texas courts handled cases involving enslaved people who killed their owners, guilty of murder in the second degree, with a recommendation for mercy based on extraordinary provocation and mitigating circumstances. 8 hours of debate had produced a compromise that acknowledged both the crime and the impossible choices that preceded it. This decision represented something unprecedented in Texas jurisprudence: recognition that enslaved people possessed emotional bonds worth protecting, even through violence that law defined as criminal. The verdict stopped short of acquittal but refused to deliver the death sentence that plantation owners demanded. Judge Eli Barrett's sentencing chamber felt smaller than usual as he struggled with punishment that would satisfy legal requirements without encouraging similar acts across Texas. The standard sentence for second-degree murder was death by hanging, but the jury's mercy recommendation gave Barrett discretionary power that placed him at the center of political pressure from multiple directions. Plantation owners demanded Nadira's execution as example to other enslaved people who might consider violence against their owners. Northern abolitionists had made her case a rallying cry, arguing that any punishment proved slavery's moral bankruptcy. Free black communities watched carefully, understanding that the sentence would establish precedents affecting their own precarious status in Texas society. Nadira Quellith, Barrett began, his voice heavy with awareness that his words would echo across generations. You have been found guilty of taking a human life under circumstances that this court acknowledges were extraordinarily difficult. However, the law requires punishment for such actions regardless of context. The sentence he delivered shocked the packed courtroom into stunned silence. 20 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary, with possibility of parole after 12 years. No execution, no immediate death, but no freedom either. The punishment was severe enough to deter copycat violence, while acknowledging through its leniency that Nadira's actions arose from circumstances that tested any parent's endurance. From the San Antonio Herald, October 15, 1852. The unprecedented sentence has caused considerable alarm among property holders who fear the court's leniency will encourage similar outrages. However, religious leaders note that mercy shown to the defendant reflects Christian values of forgiveness and recognition of human frailty. The reaction split along predictable lines. Ashton Virith stormed from the courtroom, furious that the woman who'd murdered his wife would eventually walk free. Abolitionists celebrated the verdict as proof that even Texas courts recognized slavery's violence. Enslaved people throughout San Antonio whispered Nadira's name with reverence, understanding that she'd achieved something remarkable by forcing the legal system to acknowledge her humanity. But Nadira's reaction to the sentence surprised everyone who'd expected either relief or despair. She stood calmly as chains were fastened around her wrists, then asked permission to address the court. Barrett, perhaps recognizing the historical significance of the moment, granted her request over Burke's strenuous objections. I killed Colin Vireth because she approved selling my sister Arissa like livestock to cover her husband's gambling debts, Nadira said, her voice carrying clearly through the courthouse. I accept your punishment because I understand the world you've built requires it. But I want everyone here to remember that you're not punishing a murderer. You're punishing someone who loved another person more than she feared your laws. The words would be quoted in newspapers from Boston to New Orleans, each publication interpreting them according to their political agenda. But the people who heard Nadira speak that day understood they'd witnessed something transcending legal proceedings. They'd seen someone claim full responsibility for choosing humanity over survival, for asserting that some bonds mattered more than life itself. Ashton Vireth attended the sentencing with his son, bringing the boy to witness what he called justice for their family's loss. But young Ashton Jr. seemed more interested in Nadira's composure than in her punishment. Years later, he would write that watching her accept consequences with such dignity taught him more about character than anything his father ever demonstrated. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.